Hey, this is Joe with Grow It Build It, and today I'm going to tell you all about Showy Goldenrod. One of the prettiest and most important flowers in all of North America has got to be goldenrod. Seeing fields of yellow blooming flowers in late summer and early fall is quite a sight, and it really is an important plant for wildlife too. Besides feeding and hosting numerous species, you know that these nectar plants are really important to monarch butterflies, like almost as important as milkweed. They need that late season energy to continue on their southern migration. However, most of us are all too aware of the aggressive nature of goldenrods, in particular the major rhizome producers such as Canadian goldenrod. But what if I told you that there was a species of goldenrod that was more beautiful, but not nearly as aggressive? Well, I'm going to do that today. Showy goldenrod is that plant, and it's one of the dozens and dozens of species of goldenrod, but you can keep it contained even in a manicured and mulched flower bed. But this video will be a complete profile on this flower, including what is showy goldenrod and its pros and cons, identification and growing conditions, how to grow it from seed and save the seed, and other ways to transplant it, wildlife, garden uses, maintenance, and then we will review. So I hope you stick around with me and learn about this amazing late season wildflower. So what is showy goldenrod? Well, it is just one of the nearly 100 species of goldenrod native to North America. Its native range covers basically everywhere east of the Rocky Mountains in the United States and parts of southern Canada as well. When it comes to pros and cons, the first pro is beauty. The flowering stems of showy goldenrod easily illustrate how this plant earned its common name. The bright pop of color late in the season is really stunning. Pollinators. So if you are interested in gardening for wildlife or pollinators, then this plant should be a must. The flowers produce copious amounts of nectar and pollen that feed loads of bees, butterflies, and moths. Furthermore, the plant does host several moth caterpillars. Not aggressive. Look, I would never consider planting most goldenrod species in a formal flower bed. So many different species are just too aggressive, but this one doesn't seem to send rhizomes all over the place to the degree of other goldenrod species, even though it does produce them. Again, to a lesser degree. Cons. Self-seeding. A single showy goldenrod plant will produce thousands of seeds each fall. If you grow this in a mulched flower bed, you will need to deadhead them to keep them under control. Rhizomes. Rhizomes are also known as runners, and they're like underground horizontal stems that the plant will send out and have new plants sprout from them. I know that I stated that showy goldenrod wasn't aggressive, and by goldenrod standards, it isn't. But I learned that it does in fact produce rhizomes, and it will spread vegetatively from them. Now it doesn't do so that aggressively in dry and medium moist soils, not by a long shot. Although in moist soils, it may be more aggressive. I want to point out that my comments here are based on 4 years of growing this plant, but nonetheless, we need to follow this under cons. And both of these cons I will have more to say about in the maintenance section. If you're enjoying this video, please do me a big favor and click that like button. It really helps me out, it's easy to do, and I really do appreciate it. Identification. So depending on the growing conditions, the overall plant can grow anywhere between 2 to 7 feet tall and needs spacing of 2 to 3 feet. Typically though, they're only going to get 3 to 5 feet tall in regular non-fertile soil and medium moisture. The stalk will normally consist of a round green to reddish colored stem that doesn't really branch. There will be a cluster of basal leaves at the base, and that's what you'll first see in spring when the plant first starts emerging from winter. But as the stalks go up, the leaves are alternate, and they're 2 to 6 inches long by 1 to 2 inches wide, lanceolate to elliptic in shape with smooth margins. And they're going to get smaller as you go up the stalk. The flowering stalk is unique on this plant compared to other goldenrods in that it doesn't really arch or curve. Most other goldenrods will have like a curved or an arching string of flowers, and this doesn't really have that. They point upwards. And that's a quick way to identify this plant from a distance. It's straight up and down, and it's like 9 to 15 inches long. It's covered by these hundreds and hundreds of tiny yellow flowers that are roughly a 1/4 inch diameter with around 5 to 10 petals. Root system. So the root system of Showy Goldenrod is fibrous and it will produce rhizomes. Now, if you've researched this plant at all, you may have read some references that state that it will not produce rhizome roots, but that's not true. I have video and pictures to prove that it does. However, when you also read in references that it's less aggressive, that is true, it is less aggressive, but I'll speak more about it and show it in the maintenance section. Now, I'm about to go into growing conditions, but before I do, I want to point out that all this information and more exists as an article on my website that I'll link to down below, so bookmark that for a quick reference later. For growing conditions, full sun is by far the best. It can take part shade, but it won't be as showy or as tall. This is a 3-year-old plant that I transplanted to my wildflower garden a couple of years ago. It's in a spot that receives less sun, and it does have more competition around it too, but overall the flowering stalk is only about 5-6 inches tall. The ones that are out in full sun in that formal bed are much bigger. When it comes to soil texture, it can take most of them from sandy to clay, provided there's some drainage. And for moisture, dry to medium is best. If it gets too much moisture or is in too much too fertile soil, it may get tall and top heavy and fall over. So this plant is a candidate for the Chelsea chop, and I have a video on how to do that. I'll put a link to the cards in the top right and in the notes below. All right, let's talk about how to save seed. So saving seed from Showy Goldenrod is relatively straightforward. Wait until the flowers fade, and then about a month later, these seed heads will form, and when they turn fluffy, that means the seed is ripe. At this point, you can cut off the entire stalk below the seed head and put it into a large paper bag. Let it dry out in a cool, dry, dark place for a week or so, then just shake the bag or run your hand along the stalk to release the seed. Store the seed in envelopes or Ziploc bags in a cool, dark, dry place for at least a couple years. How to grow it from seed. It's relatively easy to grow Showy Goldenrod from seed. The seeds have a 30-day cold moist stratification requirement and need exposure to sunlight to germinate. You can achieve the cold moist stratification by using a paper towel Ziploc bag in the fridge, or you can just winter sow the seed. I have video on both of these methods and I will link to them below. Personally, I find winter sowing is much easier. But to grow it from seed, fill a suitable container with moist potting soil. Then scatter the seed on the soil and press it into your thumb so it makes good contact with the soil, but don't cover it. The seed needs exposure to sunlight to germinate. Place this container in a location that gets morning sun and afternoon shade, and it will germinate when spring temperatures warm up. And then once after a month or so, after it has a few sets of true leaves, you can separate the seedlings or transplant them to a final location. In my experience, it will bloom the first year, even if you just leave it in a 4-inch pot like I did. Another way to propagate this plant is that you can transplant young plants really easily. Simply dig them up and move them around to other locations when they're dormant or near dormant in the spring or fall. It's a fibrous root system, so it's not going to go that deep. And I find this easiest to do in spring because the roots will be established, from the spring and into the summer, and there's no chance of a frost heave throwing it like in the fall. Okay, when it comes to wildlife, I really can't say enough about the number of pollinators that this plant attracts. You only need to look at this footage to see what I mean. Now, the carpenter and other bumblebees are the most apparent with their large hulking size, but there are numerous other species too. And this plant is really good at attracting wasps. Now, I'm not afraid of them, as when they're dining on nectar, they just never seem to be a threat. I can get right up to them and they don't mind at all, but they're really cool to observe up close. But there's a large number of insects that will also feed on the leaves or roots or even the stems. And these insects are in turn food for other species, so it's all part of our giant food web. And finally, there are some birds that will eat the seeds in the fall and throughout the year as they find them, although most of them will ignore it because they're just too tiny. Oh, and deer and rabbits. In my experience, they really don't bother this plant, but if you're dealing with a first-year seedling, I would protect it with liquid fence or some other deer repellent. Okay, when it comes to garden uses and maintenance. In the garden, you can use Showy Goldenrod in anything from a formal mulched flower bed to a more wild border garden or meadow or microprairie. The only thing to be aware of is that in fertile soil or areas that are moist, the plant may get too top heavy and topple over. That being said, you can perform the Chelsea chop on this plant. I have a video on how to do that. I will link to it below. But I've had this cluster of roughly 5 plants in a mulched semi-formal spot for 4 solid years now. This is actually footage of the first year, and it's just a single small flowering stalk. By year 2, they were already quite large, and they really haven't seemed to grow much beyond what they were in the second year, like not too much. So I've had new volunteer plants though, and some of which I've allowed to live in this location, others not. But having more plants creates a fuller effect and just brings in even more pollinators. In fact, if you're considering to add this plant, while you could do well with just a single specimen as a focal point, because it would throw up multiple stalks, it'd be better to have several plants because you will attract that much more wildlife. But let's talk about maintenance. The single most important maintenance factor for this plant is to deadhead the flowers, and this is to prevent self-seeding. This and other fall blooming plants usually have so many blooms that they will set seed at an amazing rate. So in formal flower beds, deadheading to remove the seeds is a must, in my opinion. But I need to say something about rhizomes. Some references state that they don't produce rhizomes, while others say they are clump forming. I had some volunteers that you can see here, and I intended to transplant them back to my wildflower area. And, a side note on that, they did just fine. But I noticed that when I was digging them up, it appeared that they were not from self-seeding. You see, the plants were not there the year before. But when I went to move them in the spring, I figured they were just new seedlings, but they didn't have much in the way of roots developed relative to their above-ground foliage. At least it seemed like it seemed disproportionate to me. But I noticed what appeared to be a small diameter rhizome running off towards a mother plant. And I thought perhaps they do have the ability to spread via rhizomes, but just don't do it that often. So either way, I do not consider this plant aggressive, as I don't have to remove many of these every spring. There's not that many. It's absolutely not comparable to other goldenrods or rhizome plants. I just wanted to share my experience with you guys on this and make you aware that this potential does exist. All right, time to review. Showy Goldenrod is a herbaceous wildflower native to eastern North America. It can grow 2 to 7 feet tall depending on growing conditions, but typically is only 3 to 5 feet tall in full sun and regular soils. It does an amazing job of attracting and feeding pollinators, as well as providing food to the ecosystem in other ways. And it can be used in all sorts of manners in the garden, but one should take care to prevent self-seeding each year. And you may have some rhizome sprouts, but in my experience, it is not overwhelming. But that's all I've got for you today. If you enjoyed this video, please give me a thumbs up, as it's an easy way to help me out and I truly appreciate it. And check my article linked below if you need a quick reference later. It contains even more information than what I shared in this video. But all right, you guys all have a good one and enjoy this gratuitous pollinator footage.